Izobraževanje v zgodnjem otroštvu, graditev vrednot in dobrega značaja, pa je naslov predavanja našega uglednega gosta. Na oder prihaja oziroma k mikrofonu profesor dr. David CARR. David CARR je profesor filozofije izobraževanja na Univerzi v Edinburghu, torej profesor na Univerzi v Birminghamu in zaslužni profesor emeritus na Univerzi v Edinburghu in je specialist za vzgojo in etiko. Je avtor knjige Izobraževanje vrlin in strokovnost in etična vprašanja pri pouku, kot tudi številnih filozofskih in izobraževalnih dokumentov. Njegovi raziskovalni interesi se osredotočajo na filozofijo izobraževanja, etiko vrlin in moralno vzgojo, naravo strokovnosti in poklicno etiko, znanje, izobraževanje in teorije, kurikuluma in tako naprej. Literaturo k njegovemu predavanju boste lahko dvignili kasneje v preddverju. Warmly welcome, Professor Dr. David CARR.
I must first apologize. I have no Slovenian. The other thing I might say is my father fought in the First World War. Probably, I'm afraid, on the wrong side, on the other side. So I don't know how old that makes me. First, the other thing I should say is I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Trantel for this kind invitation to Slovenia to talk to such a distinguished audience in such a stunningly beautiful country. I am so impressed with this country, I can't wait to come back again. I'm going to talk about, I should say first of all that I'm not a social scientist or any other kind of scientist. I'm a philosopher by training. Nobody's perfect. But I should also say that, and of course I have worked as a university lecturer for many years. By the way, I'm emeritus professor at Edinburgh and currently professor of ethics and education at Birmingham. But I should also say, in terms of credentials, that and knowing that practicing teachers can often be very suspicious of university academics, quite rightly, given the nonsense that we talk for much of the time. I should also say that I was, in the early part of my career, a primary teacher. And I have taught children as young as 7. So I have substantial experience of primary education, both as a teacher and also as a teacher educator, for which I have spent most of my career in Edinburgh University. So I've spent an awful lot of time observing teachers in classrooms, observing teachers, and at the University of Birmingham I still work with primary teachers on several of the projects we have there. So I'm very interested in primary education. It's interested me for a very long time. It's been very much a part of my life. But I am going to be talking today about the theory of moral education, by and large, particularly as it does apply to early years education. And there is an immense literature on this. I mean, the literature is enormous. There are journals devoted to papers on moral education. There is a journal of moral education which has been going for a very long time now. Very many books have been written on it, and I'm afraid I've contributed to this general tangle of confusion about moral education as much as anybody. So I'm not going to be able to cover that today. I'm just going to basically highlight a few points, and I mean a few points. I'm going to focus first of all on the general drift to date of thinking about moral education over the last, I suppose, about the last century or so, although I'm going to be going back to earlier thinkers than that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of development. I think you have these pages already in your notes, so I won't stick to the PowerPoint too closely, particularly as I have a tendency, I'm not good with PowerPoint and I tend to lose my place with it quite a bit. So I can't cover the whole literature, but I'm just going to highlight a few points. I'm going to talk a bit about the general theory. I'm going to talk about some ideas about development. And then I'm going to talk about some notions about the curriculum, how we might actually think about moral education with early years in schools. The unreflective person at the bus stop's view of moral education would be that, well, moral education is just about making children behave well, getting them to do as they are told. Well, as very many progressive educators and others have pointed out, getting people to do as they're told is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for moral engagement or moral life or moral agency. People who are doing as they're told can behave very badly. And likewise, one can be often behaving very well by not doing as one's told. So I suppose the general agreement among philosophers is that morality, moral association, moral agency involves something like the use of reason, involves the use of reflection. As philosophers would put it, to be a moral agent is to be reasons responsive, to be able to respond to reasons, to be able to behave reflectively, to be able to engage in deliberation, in thought about what we should do or our relations to other people. There the problems, of course, start, because then philosophers disagree immensely about what kinds of reasons, moral reasons are. What is moral life? What counts as a moral reason? And there are as many views on that as there are philosophers, I'm afraid. So this is not an easy question to settle. But I'm going to, I think I should draw attention first of all to a particular theory about morality, moral development and moral education that dominated the field for practically, for much of the post-war period, from about the 1960s till, I suppose, the 1990s or thereabouts. And this is the theory of the American developmental psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg was a disciple, I suppose, in many ways, of the great Swiss psychologist Piaget, Jean Piaget. And through him, because Piaget himself was deeply influenced by the philosophy of Kant, Kohlberg was also influenced by Kant. And Kohlberg was trying to develop a theory of moral development and moral education for a liberal society, a society in which people would be encouraged to think for themselves, to deliberate, to their own values, to reflect on, to try to develop a set of values that were authentic, that were autonomous rather than heteronymous. In other words, people shouldn't be doing things simply because other people tell them to do things, but should be doing things because they see them as the right thing to do. So Kohlberg, I'll just press this on. Kohlberg develops a quite complex theory of moral development, which is partly empirically based. Kohlberg claimed to have based these stages of moral development on actual empirical observation. Basically, he differentiates between, well, let's say first of all that this theory of moral development has certain distinctive features. The first distinctive feature is it is a theory of the development of moral cognition, or the development of moral reflection or rationality. Following the great German philosopher Kant, Kohlberg held, at least for much of the way, that moral life, moral decision-making, moral deliberation is actually a matter of the development of rationality. Feeling does not come into it. Emotion doesn't come into it. The great philosopher Kant argued that anybody who behaves, I don't know, gives charity to a beggar, say, because they feel sympathy towards the beggar, because they feel feelings towards the beggar, is not behaving morally. You're only behaving morally if you actually act in the light of reflection on the basis of rational principle. And the rational principles that Kant attempts to identify, which he wants to call duties or obligations, wants to regard as duties or obligations, are principles that are what he calls universalizable. One couldn't wish that people shouldn't behave in this kind of way. So the moral principles that are universalizable in any society, people should see it as rational to behave, to tell the truth, to behave fairly towards other people, to be just in some sense, to be benevolent towards other people. So the range of values that Kant thinks are universal. And what Kohlberg tries to do, what Kohlberg argues, is that moral development, moral education through moral development, is actually the cultivation of certain capacities to be for the recognition or the appreciation of principled values of this kind, universalizable values. But the other feature of Kohlberg's theory is that it is developmental. He thinks that children are not born with these universalizable principles, they have to grow into them. So children at earlier stages, and here remember he's influenced by Piaget. So his views of moral development very much follow Piaget's own views of moral development. His is just a more elaborate version of them. So Kohlberg argues that young children do not behave, do not act, do not reflect in a morally principled way. In the early stages of their development, they will behave, in the first stages of development, they will behave in a particular way just because they are trying to avoid punishment for doing the wrong thing, or they want to attract praise for doing the right thing. But that, on a Kantian view, certainly, is not moral behavior. It's prudential behavior. It's behavior that perhaps is to our advantage in certain circumstances, but it's not moral behavior. We're only behaving really as moral agents until we act on a principled basis. And likewise, in the next two stages of the development for Kohlberg, children are recognizing a certain sort of social value, an interpersonal value in behaving morally, but they're still not behaving morally in a full sense. So it's really only in the last stages of development that Kohlberg holds after Kant that I think that might be mine. Is it? I don't know. Stopped anyway. So it's only in the last stages of his stage theory that Kohlberg actually thinks that after Kant that people are behaving as true moral agents. Now, Kohlberg's theory was highly influential. I'll try to move it on. I'll try to keep the pace if I can. Kohlberg's theory of moral development was highly influential for a very long period, probably between about 30 and 40 years. Kohlberg's theory held the field. I think it's now almost universally recognized across the board that it won't do, that it's a mistaken theory in very many respects. And I want to, for present purposes, to identify a couple of respects in which it won't do as a theory. It's now being criticized. You won't find a paper on Kohlberg's theory nowadays in the journals, in the literature, that is not critical. There are two, I suppose, principal grounds for criticism of Piaget's, of Kohlberg's theory. One is that it is excessively rationalist, excessively cognitivist, and it leaves out moral sentiment, it leaves out feeling. Many philosophers would argue that, well, Kant is just wrong to suppose that somebody giving to a beggar out of sympathy is not behaving morally. It seems to be a perfectly good motive for giving to charity, that you feel sorry for the people, that you feel sympathy for, at least, the kind of people you're giving the money to. So the second respect in which Kohlberg, I'll keep confusing the two, I'm afraid. But the second respect in which Kohlberg's theory seems to be suspect is that it's possible, I think as has been alluded to in earlier sessions, it's possible for somebody to know what is the right thing to do, know perfectly well, be able to justify what is the right thing to do, but yet do the wrong thing. And actually, I think that describes most of us. Most of us know perfectly well when we behave badly at that office party that this is the wrong thing to do, but we still do it anyway. So there needs to be some kind of moral behavior, moral agency needs to have some kind of basis, firm basis in motivation. We need to be motivated to do the right thing to do, as well as feeling sympathy to the objects of our charity or other emotions and so on, as well as actually reasoning in the right sort of way. Now, again, most of the people who have, both Kohlberg on the one hand and people who have objected to his theory, like Nell Noddings and Licona, who I think were mentioned in the previous overhead, most of their views derive from various forms of modern philosophy or modern social science. Most of them observe, and this may be the problem with them, some rather strict, they overdraw some distinction between reason and feeling in their own ways. What the second half of the 20th century saw was a huge revival in interest in the so-called virtue ethics of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, why go back from modern thinkers, who you might think, after all, are modern and new, therefore they must be right? Why go back to an ancient philosopher like Aristotle? Well, the fact is that some of the greatest contemporary minds in ethics and moral philosophy have returned to Aristotle because they've seen in Aristotle all sorts of ways through the kinds of problems that modern moral philosophers have raised. One of the things, and again, I can't go into this in any great detail, but one of the things that Aristotle's philosophy does is it attempts to bring together certain fundamental, morally relevant ideas or aspects of human psychology. It attempts to bring together precisely reason, feeling, and or reason, emotion, and also volition, also motivation. By the way, it's rather important here in talking about the relationship between feeling and reason in moral philosophy or in moral psychology, perhaps to distinguish between emotions and feelings. Many modern philosophers have talked as though, modern ethicists have talked about as though moral life and moral association and moral agency might be rooted in either feeling or reason. Aristotle would reject this. But it's important here probably to draw a distinction between feeling and emotion. Aristotle thinks that emotions are very, very important, are a very, very important part of moral development. Coming to feel in the right way through the right emotions is very, very important for Aristotle. But emotions are not just feelings. We might feel in all sorts of ways about people, but we do not necessarily experience emotions for Aristotle unless we come to see the world in a particular sort of way. So emotions are not just feelings. Emotions also involve some element of cognition. So in other words, young children, people in general, in the course of their moral development, need not only to develop capacities for right reasoning, right deliberation, right reflection in moral matters, they also need to develop the right emotions. And the development of emotions is very, very important matter for Aristotle, and I'll say a little bit about that a little later on. But certainly Aristotle's view is that moral reflection, and he takes a very, very different view of moral reflection. He has a different conception of moral reflection from Kohlberg and Kant. Aristotle's view is that that right moral education begins in very early childhood, and it begins with precisely something like moral training in the right sorts of habits, under the right sorts of guidance by parents and teachers. Likewise, children in the early stages of moral development learn emotion, learn the language of emotion, learn to be able to discriminate between emotions. Emotions, and I remember, are not just feelings. They learn to discriminate between different emotions under the guidance of parents and teachers. We are taught emotion, just as we are taught moral reason. So it's not just the feelings are something that we're born with, and that's the end of it. We need to cultivate emotions in order to cultivate a rich moral life. One problem with Aristotle, however, is that, curiously, like Kohlberg, he seems to subscribe to a kind of a perspective on human moral growth that emphasizes development, certainly explicitly in stages in the case of Kohlberg, but in Aristotle as well. It seems that Aristotle wants to say that that mature moral reflection is something that younger children are not capable of. Why? Because he seems to think, not unlike Piaget, he seems to think that certain kinds of reflection, certain kinds of cognition are not appropriate to young children. He thinks that young children, young people, are not capable of engaging in the more in mature moral reflection. They need to leave that until the age of discretion. Now, it would be hard to underestimate, I don't know what Slovenia is like, but it would be hard to underestimate the extent to which a particularly Piagetian theories of human development have influenced primary education. Piaget, certainly at certain periods in the last century in British schools, and I think elsewhere, Piaget was taught as though it was absolutely right. As though Piaget had discovered as a matter of fact, by observation, by empirical observation, that children do develop through different stages. I think, and I think I would not be alone nowadays in saying that such developmentalism, such blind faith in developmental theories like Piaget and so on, is suspect. That there are good reasons for doubting that children develop, particularly in the rigid stages, which Piaget and Kohlberg describe. To a certain extent, their stages may reflect changes in children over the years, but there are reasons for doubting that they develop in this kind of rigid stage sort of way. One of the reasons, there are quite a lot of reasons that emerge in literature for supposing this. One is that developmental theories have found it particularly difficult to show how higher stages of reflection can emerge out of what are allegedly lower stages of reflection. A lot of the literature is addressed to that concern and has so far not been successful in showing how stage theories can get over it. It's worth mentioning here that one important source for doubting Piagetian or other developmentalism comes from what's sometimes been called the philosophy for children movement in Britain and the USA. The philosophy of children movement holds that philosophy is an important form of human discourse. It's an important form of human rationality. It holds that even small children can learn to philosophize, can learn to ask quite searching questions about the meaning of concepts, for example. Piaget appears to have held that small children would not be capable of that kind of abstract reflection. That abstract reflection only comes later. As I say, to some extent, this idea is echoed in Aristotle as well. Philosophy of movement, and I've seen philosophy done in primary classrooms, philosophy for children has shown very much that young children are capable of quite sophisticated reflection on quite complex conceptual issues. So there are reasons for questioning both developmentalism in its modern form and in its more ancient form in Aristotle. How long have we got? Shortly, right. Well, having made these critical points on developmental ideas in general, I want to move to I want to move to some observations about the possible ways in which we might encourage something like moral development in the classroom. What might moral education look like in the school curriculum, or in particular, in this context, in the primary school curriculum? How might we best help young people, children, to acquire some sense of moral agency, some sense of moral reflection, some sense of moral deliberation? One of the, again, perhaps unfortunate features of Kohlbergian thinking about the nature of moral development and moral education, which, remember, emphasized the development of moral rationality, was that it encouraged the view that moral education might stand alongside other subjects, such as history or maths or geography, as a separate subject in the school curriculum. And in fact, I think there were many attempts, certainly in countries like Britain and America. There were definite attempts to try to develop a distinctive subject of moral education in the school curriculum. A place, children, a time in the school day when children would actually study something like, or look at or discuss moral dilemmas or moral questions of the kind that feature prominently in Kohlberg's theories. One of the famous case studies, the empirical part of Kohlberg's project is very much based on presenting children with particular case studies or dilemmas. One of these famous case studies is called the Heinz dilemma. And the Heinz dilemma is the short story of a man whose wife is dying of cancer. And he cannot, there is a drug available that will cure his wife of cancer, but the person who's manufacturing the drug is charging a too high price for it and won't let the man have it because the man can't afford it. In that case, the question to the children is, well, what should Heinz do in these circumstances? Kohlberg reported that children at different ages gave different answers to this question. Children at pre-moral stages of development tended to give the answer, well, you should not steal, Heinz should not steal the drug because stealing is wrong. But children at a later stage of development, according to Piaget, might give the question, well, given the circumstances here, it might be appropriate for Heinz to try to obtain the drug by some kind of dishonest means. And it was on this basis, very much on this kind of basis, that Kohlberg tried to distinguish between different levels of moral development. That, to begin with, clearly won't do, because it seems that in decontextualized dilemmas of that kind, it's possible for people to give different answers to that question at different stages of their development, given attention to different details of the story. So the fact that somebody says Heinz should steal the drug, and somebody else said he shouldn't, doesn't necessarily signify that one is at a higher stage of development. But it seems that there's anyway something wrong about the fundamental idea, something very counterintuitive about the fundamental idea that, well, moral education should be just another subject like geography or history or mathematics, that it should occur in some period of the school days. It seems that this gets the wrong idea about what moral education is. It seems to get the wrong idea about what morality is, what moral association is. Moral education, morality is not something that occurs at a particular point in the school day. It's obviously something that's interwoven in the whole fabric of human life and human association. So moral education couldn't go on just at one particular point in the school curriculum. We have to think about it as something that permeates the child's school and home life and wider association as such. Moral education cannot be just another subject. It must be part of the wider, rich fabric of children's lives. Having said that, then, are there no particular areas of the school curriculum that might be valuable, particularly valuable, from the point of view of promoting moral education? Well, we've heard a lot of talk today so far on behalf of the importance or the value of science, or even social science, for helping us to understand moral agency, helping us to understand what moral behavior is. Now, I wouldn't want to deny that science, neuroscience, for example, has its place. Some kind of understanding of how the human brain works might have a place in helping us to understand moral behavior. I wouldn't want to deny that the social sciences, that psychology, can give us some help in understanding human behavior, understanding moral agency. But teachers are not brain scientists, and they should not try to become brain scientists. Teachers are people who are placed to help children understand their world. They are in the position to help those children understand their world to a great extent in terms of, against a background of, an immensely rich cultural heritage. From this point of view, I was actually overjoyed this morning to hear the Minister of Education mention Dante. If we want to help children understand their moral world, what better way could we find than to acquaint them with the rich cultural heritage that is available in great human literature, in the great myths, in the great stories, in the great narratives of mankind, going right back through Shakespeare and Milton, right back to Genesis, or right back to the religious traditions of other cultures, like, for example, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, the Indian traditions. But these great cultural narratives, what are they about? By and large, they are about the rights and wrongs, the dilemmas of human conduct. They're about human association. They're about moral association. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, wants to argue that understanding morality is a matter of the mastery of a form of practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is acquired, is cultivated through practical reflection, and that's a different sort of reflection from theoretical reflection. The theoretical reflection of science. Science tells us about how the world is, and it tells us very, very valuable things about how the world is. But practical reason is not about that. Practical reason is about deliberating on the nature of human conduct, on the nature of human virtue and vice, in order to know what to do. And so, when Aristotle turns in his works to consider what kinds of literature might help us to understand the nature of virtue, the nature of moral life, he turns to not scientists, but to Euripides and Aeschylus and to Sophocles and to Homer, because these are the great resources. This was the great Greek heritage of literature which could help people of his time understand, well, to have some kind of grasp of their own identity, grasp of their own values, help them to critique their own values. Euripides in the Trojan Women, what does he show? He doesn't show the Greeks victorious after the Trojan War. What he shows is the Trojan women being subjected to all kinds of abuse by Greeks. The Greeks for whom Euripides was performing his plays. He was holding up a moral mirror to their society and saying, look, you Greeks, this is how you behave. This is what you are, according to your own legends. And you need to become better people. And this is what Shakespeare can show us. This is what Dante can show us. This is what Milton can show us. What Yaroslav Hasek can show us through the good soldier Schweik. These are not just stories, they are moral stories. Okay? Important resources from the point of view of moral growth, moral agency. And what I found supervising students in schools to the end of my teaching career, end of my teaching supervision career at Edinburgh, was that teachers in schools did not know how to use great literature or any sort of literature. They would use literature in order to occupy, they would use it to read to children during the break, just to keep them quiet. Right? They did not use them as an opportunity to explore rich human values, rich concepts of human association, to help them to understand their world, to help them understand the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, between good character and bad character. So, in closing, what I want to commend, and this is one of the projects we've been doing in Birmingham, we've been looking at some of the classic stories of the past, and we've been introducing these into primary schools. Stories of King Arthur, for example, and his Knights of the Round Table. Stories about Gareth, and which display various kinds of human qualities, character qualities, humility, bravery, courage, justice, fairness. Okay? All of these are great stories of the past, are illustrative of these fundamental human virtues that Aristotle saw as constitutive of the good life. And what's more, the children in schools love them. Absolutely love them. They've taken to these stories like the proverbial rat up a drain pipe. So that's really about all I have to say for now. Let's try to benefit from various theories of moral education and development that have been developed over the years. Kohlberg has things to teach us. I'm not rubbishing it, but nevertheless, I think Kohlberg's theory has serious defects, which we may need to look to other resources in order to get the right view. And I think that Aristotle shows us the right way. And beyond Aristotle, through great modern philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre, helps to show us how great literature can be an important moral resource for the education of people young and old. Too long.